When I was 13, I put my SNES in a box in my attic, along with many of the fashionable items of the era. I moved on to the Nintendo 64. It wasn't until a few years later that I came across a copy of Donkey Kong Country at a swap meet for only $2 with a torn cover. I instantly remembered wanting to play through this game, having to run the sequel a few years back. I thought it would be an interesting flashback and an excuse to dust off the old SNES. I forgot about it because I was going out of town the following summer, so it sat on the shelf collecting dust for some months. Months turned to years, and the cartridge was forgotten about. It wasn't until 2011 that I opened up an old box containing my broken PS2, my PS1 without cables, and a set of boxes containing various things that I ponder were stolen throughout my youth. Among them was that Donkey Kong Country cartridge. Now over 20 years, I decided that maybe it was time that I dust off the SNES and give the game a go. I put the cartridge in, hoping to finally play the Donkey Kong Country that rested in the back of my subconscious for the better part of a decade. The cover was severely damaged, and one thing I noticed after looking at the cartridge online was that the ones released in store were gray, while this one was yellow, and what I could assume was a prototype. I do know that some of the N64 cartridges are yellow, but this was an entirely different game on an entirely different console. The front of the cover was completely ripped at the bottom, with that torn paper looks that the cartridges tend to get over time. Someone had scrawled the words Cold War 1989 with what I could assume was a Sharpie. Regardless, I switched the SNES on. The game started as normal, but there was no rare logo, nor did the screen make any mention of Nintendo. The beginning animation started with Cranky Kong, aka Donkey Kong the First, turning the Vino players per usual atop some metal beams. I was playing on a flat screen with a default SNES cable hookup, but the picture seemed a little grainier. The music was completely different. It sounded muffled and drowned out, even though it was the same song. Donkey Kong would drop down and knock out Cranky Kong while he enjoyed his modern record. Instead of a boombox, it was a hand melded with a red anvil, falling on top of Cranky Kong. Donkey Kong dropped down for dance animation, but his graphic was off-center by about 15 pixels, and every direction up and left his hand was also elongated by about 3 inches. When Cranky throws the TNT barrel, the game just froze. I had to reset it several times just to play the game. I had to quickly run Donkey Kong off the main map and into jungle hijinks before the game froze again. Donkey Kong's graphic was sadder. I went into the small room, Kong's Banana Horde, and the game locked up for 3 seconds before putting me on a weird island that wasn't in any of the game footage I've seen online. There were fully rendered pirate skeletons, and Donkey Kong couldn't interact at all. I eventually had to lose a life by jumping into the ocean before I was returned to the entrance of Jungle Hijinks. I started to play through the game, but I noticed that every time I made Donkey Kong jump on a barrel, the picture got grainier and dark tinged. It seemed as though a programming bug was making the screen more sippy tinged. The music was also way off. Most of the time, it was flipping between sound channels, and other times, it wouldn't play at all. After Jungle Hijinks, I couldn't move on to the next stage, Sawtooth Mines. Now, this wasn't the stage that normally followed in the game. I had to move Donkey Kong upwards to an unmarked area of the world map. It had a weird X mark by two trees, and it was barely visible. It was an underwater stage with no music, and all the coral was red. The area looked more or less like a river of blood. I swam Donkey Kong downward with no collectible bananas. It wasn't until about 30 minutes of swimming downwards that I noticed something that looked like a human eye emerging from the rocks, painted in the backdrop. It was getting more visible the lower I swam. I also had to double tap the buttons because the swimming had a delay. I noticed an error meter after about 3 minutes. Finally, the screen froze and some text appeared. If you wish to enter Sawtooth Mines, first you have to pay the fine. The drowning animation of Donkey Kong was shown. That was very disturbing. He clenched his neck and pulled off his tie, and the final display was the life that was sucked out of him. The screen went black and glitched out. I restarted the SNES, but this time Donkey Kong's sprite was completely white, and I was on a stage called In Limbo. It was just a typical rope swing that seemed to have gone recycled from another stage with a lot of glitches and missing parts of the ground that looked like pits but could be walked over. The various razor bees also couldn't damage me. I thought it was impossible to die. I know this wasn't in the original game, but what concerned me more was there was a trap door near the exit. I felt compelled to finish the stage, but more compelled to break through the trapdoor. I remember from other DKC games that if you reach a high enough height, you could break through them. I found a set of ledges at the start of the stage and got through the top of the map until I got to the end, occasionally jumping higher than the screen would allow. The whole process took over an hour, and I wasn't sure how much juice my SNES had left, but I did it. I finally jumped off the top. I crashed through the trapdoor. Inside was a long hallway with what looked like a Chinese character on the floor. At the end was a snake sprite. It may have been a prototype for the spring snakes that never made it into the game. The song DK Island Swing abruptly started, and there was a very weird text. My name is Adam. I'm 13. They've abducted and are holding my family captive. If you can read this, I'm about to be drowned to death. Please, send help before it's too late. I felt my spine tingle as a 16-bit picture of a chimpanzee flashed on the screen in a quarter of a second. It was then that I realized Diddy Kong wasn't a playable character in this edition of the game. There was an abrupt sound of a monkey squealing. It sounded like it was in intense pain. The game finally launched Donkey Kong through a set of barrels. I decided to try to finish the game, so I was put back on the map. I finally entered Sawtooth Mines. It was a minecart stage, but the track never moved. I heard what sounded like a grainy city's voice began to whisper. I jumped on the tracks, trying to figure out if there was a trick to it. The whisper started to sound like thunder. It hissed, but it was still illegible. I kept on jumping on the track, thinking maybe the jumping was triggered by some timing. I tried endlessly to finish the level, but I assumed it couldn't be. I left the game on for a full 40 hours. I knew if I reset, I would either have to start all over, or the game might break completely. It was already extremely glitched. I left that SNES and I wanted to sleep. It was hard to sleep with the game running because Donkey Kong sprites started to look sad after a while. The hissing was disturbing, but it seemed to be altering. As I slept on my bunk bed, I heard the voice whisper, It sounded like an animal trying to form words. I immediately tried to make Donkey Kong jump, but there was no feedback for the player anymore. The 16-bit voice kept pleading, as the eye emerged from the blackness again. It zoned out more and more until I saw it. It was the face of a grainy, disheveled ape with blood on its face. What have they done to my son? The voice hissed and crackled from the data technology, and then I paused the game. It then turned into a slideshow. A weird slideshow of 16-bit images showing weird laboratory in England. Visuals very hard to see on the 16-bit console, but there was obviously pictures of apes in cages being drowned in some kind of cage experiment. Many were being tortured while people took notes. The faces of the people were completely blacked out, but they looked to be middle-aged scientists. One shot was of them showing a disassembled ape head. One showed the people in a very familiar pose, one that I recognized in England. That was all I knew, but I continued. There was a real depiction of a human torso being eaten by an ape with sharp, bloody fangs. The entrails were leading out to the other room. The torso had been the human's eyes, right down to a piece of meat. The next shot was a date tag of prison convict who I assumed had donated his body to science. I tried to go back to compare the two images of the eaten torso and the prison convict to see if the body type was similar, but I couldn't go back in the slideshow. The last shot was just the title screen with the words "You'll Go Bananas, 1989" in the normal text game font. I pressed start and was back at the end of the level. Nowhere left to go. I couldn't go back to Sawtooth Mines. Jungle hijinks was the only possible option. I went back to the banana horde. Ended up back on the abandoned island. The skeletons looked more familiar. In fact, they were doing the same pose the people in the slideshow were doing. After about 15 minutes, I found out that after you pressed down and held for 3 seconds, names would appear. All of them were rare employees who worked on the game. One was a larger, more ape-like skeleton and was the anomaly of the bunch, and its name was simple. It was Adam, aka Mr. Bojangles, with a sad emoticon afterward. This time, when I made Donkey Kong lose a life, the game truly froze. No resets. I tried finding information about the cartridge online, but it was to no avail. I didn't want to upload footage of the game because the gore disturbing imagery was definitely going to get me flagged and banned on YouTube. I put the cartridge on eBay before being hit with a $600,000 lawsuit from the Rare Company. I got threatening messages that my life as a business contractor and plumber was basically over. If I ever released the cartridge to the public, they would merely suggest that it was just a prank regarding some of the Rare employees having fun. But I knew what I knew. The blood, the gore, the dead apes. That was no prank. Rare had done something terrible beyond my imagination. To get the final Donkey Kong Country Store product on the shelves, I told them that I had destroyed the cartridge. Stop the harassing phone calls and letters affectionately addressed to Super Fuckface Mario. Suddenly, my plumbing profession had ruffled the feathers of some of the higher-ups. I still have the cartridge, though. It's in my other old stuff. It'll sit there for days. Days will become weeks, months, and then years. The cartridge will still be there, I promise. If they want it so badly, they'll have to pry it from my cold, dead, fucking hand.